On the night of October the 18th, 1880, the temperature on the Dakota Territory prairie dropped 50 degrees in 6 hours. The wind came from the northwest at 80 miles per hour, driving snow so hard and so horizontal that it was impossible to distinguish the sky from the ground. Men who stepped outside to check their livestock walked 15 feet from their cabin doors and were never seen alive again. The cold had no interest in mercy. It had no interest in who deserved to survive and who did not. It simply arrived the way all catastrophic things arrive, without warning and without apology. But inside a circle of hay on a quarter section, claimed 3 miles from the nearest town, a 62-year-old Norwegian widow stood in the eye of that storm and felt almost nothing. Not because she was not afraid. She was afraid. She had been afraid since May. But the wall she had built with bleeding hands and borrowed grass and more desperation than she had ever known in 62 years of living was holding. The wind that was killing people 10 miles in every direction could not find a flat surface to push against. It found the curve instead. It found the shape she had learned from a herd of cattle on a summer afternoon, and it flowed around it the way water flows around a stone, leaving the air inside nearly still. Inside the circle, her firewood was dry. Inside the cabin, her grandchildren were alive. This is the story of how that circle came to exist and what it cost to build it. Britta Sundvall arrived at her son's homestead claim in Dakota Territory in May of 1880. She arrived 3 weeks after burying him in a field outside Miller. Her son, Christopher, had died the way many men died on the open prairie, not from disease or violence, but from the simple arithmetic of distance and cold. He had gone to cut firewood in the river bottom 12 miles south. He had planned to be back in 2 days. A late blizzard caught him 6 miles from shelter on the return journey. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 2 hours. He had no place to go and no way to get there quickly enough. They found him 4 days later, still holding the ox reins. The oxen had survived by huddling together in a ravine. Christopher had not. He was 34 years old. Britta had 2 grandchildren. Solveig was 9, with her father's serious eyes, in a habit of finishing tasks that adults had abandoned. Eric was 6, small for his age, with the pale blonde hair of the Sundvall line and a laugh that his grandfather had possessed and that now existed nowhere else in the world except in this child. Their mother had died of fever 18 months earlier. There was no one else. Britta had crossed an ocean at 40 to follow her husband to Minnesota, had buried that husband at 57, had built her life back from the foundation twice already. She understood that the world did not stop to let you finish grieving. She took the children. She came to the claim. She stood in the doorway of the 12 by 14-foot board shanty that Christopher had built in 3 weeks from green lumber, hauled 22 miles from the railroad depot, and she looked at what he had managed to create before the winter took him. The walls were 1 inch thick, 1 inch of green lumber, and a single layer of tar paper already peeling at the corners where the wind had worked it loose through the spring. By August, as the wood dried and shrank in the relentless Dakota sun, Britta could see daylight through the cracks where the boards had pulled apart. She stuffed them with rags. She stuffed them with old newspaper. She stuffed them with whatever she could find that would slow the wind's entry into the space where her grandchildren slept. The wind found every gap. It always found every gap. She had $3 sewn into the hem of her dress. The memory that Britta Sundvall carried with her through every day of that summer was a specific one. Not the image of Christopher in the field, not the funeral, not the long wagon ride to a claim she had never seen. The memory was from the previous winter, from the last days of February, from a night that she had almost not survived. The winter of 1879 to 1880 had been mild by Dakota standards. This was what people told her afterward. Mild. By February, she had burned everything that would burn. The children slept in their coats. She woke every 2 hours to feed the stove, moving through the darkness by feel, because the lamp oil was gone, her breath visible in the air 6 feet from the fire. And then in the final weeks of winter, the firewood froze. A 3-day blizzard in late February buried the remaining wood pile under a drift that packed solid as poured concrete. She attacked it with an axe for 2 hours and freed 3 sticks. She burned the kitchen chair. She burned the wooden crate that had carried their dishes from Minnesota. She burned Christopher's boots, watching the leather curl and blacken, while the children shivered under every blanket they owned. On the 3rd night, when the stove went cold and the temperature inside the cabin dropped to 19 degrees, she put both children in the bed with her and pulled every blanket and coat over them and waited for the sun. Eric stopped shivering sometime before dawn. That was the most terrifying moment of her life. Not Christopher's death, not the letter that told her, not standing at his grave in the spring mud. The most terrifying moment was the moment when her 6-year-old grandson stopped shivering because she knew what it meant when a body stopped shivering in cold like that. She had grown up on a farm in Norway. She had watched animals in winter. She knew. The body was not cold enough to shiver anymore. The body was beginning to give up. She rubbed his arms. She rubbed his legs. She breathed on his face with whatever warmth she still had in her lungs and talked to him in Norwegian and English, in a language that was neither just sound and presence and the refusal to stop. She talked until the sun came up and the temperature climbed just enough that she could get a fire started with twisted hay. They survived. Eric lost the tip of his left ear to frostbite. Solveig developed a cough that lasted until May. Britta lost 4 toes on her right foot to frostbite in the night that she had not known was happening because she had been focused entirely on the child beside her. She wrapped the foot. She kept walking. She did not tell the children. Now it was the summer of 1880, and she had $3, and the next winter was coming. The problem was not the cold. Cold was a number on a thermometer, a thing you could measure and prepare for and endure if you had enough fuel and enough insulation. Cold was manageable. The problem was the wind. Halvor Bjerre came to tell her this in late August. He was 65 years old, the first Norwegian settler in the county, a man who had survived 11 Dakota winters and who had buried 2 sons to the cold. Eric in the blizzard of 1873, Gunnar in the winter of 1876. When Halvor Bjerre spoke about survival on the Dakota prairie, people listened because he had paid for the knowledge in a currency that no one could argue with. He rode his gray mare the 3 miles from his own claim on a Thursday morning, arriving before 9, with the deliberate timing of a man who has something difficult to say and wants to say it before the day gets complicated. He studied the cabin for a long time before he dismounted. He walked the perimeter slowly, pressing his palm against the thin walls, looking at the gaps in the tar paper, examining the single window that would be sealed with ice by December. He kicked at the foundation where the earth had eroded. He looked at the open prairie in all 4 directions, the complete absence of anything that might slow the wind before it reached the cabin. Then he turned to face her. "Your walls are too thin," he said. His Norwegian accent had been worn by decades of English into something that was neither language fully, but carried the precision of both. "And you have no windbreak." "Nothing. The wind will come from the northwest at 40 miles an hour, maybe 50, and it will pull the heat from this cabin like a man skinning a rabbit. Your stove cannot fight that. No stove can fight that." "I know," Britta said. "I lived through last winter." "You lived through a mild winter." He said it without cruelty, as a statement of fact. "In a hard winter, this cabin will kill you." He looked at the children. Solveig was drawing something in the dirt near the well with a stick. Eric was chasing a grasshopper with the total commitment of a 6-year-old who has decided this is the most important task in the world. "It will kill them first," Bjerre said. "Children lose heat faster than adults. Their bodies are smaller. They have less reserve. You will watch them go before you go yourself." Britta felt the words settle into her chest like stones dropped into cold water. She had heard hard truths before. She had delivered a few herself. But there was a particular weight to this one because it was not cruel. It was not meant to wound. It was the statement of a man who had watched his own sons die and who would not let another family arrive at that knowledge unprepared. "What do I need?" she said. Bjerre walked the perimeter of the cabin again. "You need walls 2 feet thick, properly banked. Or you need to dig into a hillside and build a true dugout. Or you need—" He stopped. "How much money do you have?" $3. He looked at her for a long moment, then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a man confronting an arithmetic problem that has no solution and who recognizes in the confronting of it something almost like absurdity. $3, he said. "You cannot buy lumber. You cannot buy sod. You cannot hire anyone to dig you a root cellar." He shook his head slowly. "I buried my wife's sister because she tried to winter in a cabin like this. She had more money than you. She had a husband. She still froze to death in February when her firewood ran out. What should I do? Go back to wherever you came from. Take those children somewhere warm. This is no place for a woman alone with no money and no help and no windbreak. The wind will freeze your firewood solid, and then it will freeze you. He mounted his horse and gathered the reins. I am sorry to speak plain, he said, but I have seen too many people die on this prairie because no one told them the truth in time. He rode away without looking back. Britta watched him go. She hated him, and she knew he was right, and she stood there in the August heat, holding both of those things until they settled into something she could use. Not despair, not anger, something colder and more useful than either. $3, 2 children, 5 months until the worst of winter, a cabin that would kill them, find another way. Harmon Steck appeared on a Tuesday in August, arriving from the north on a horse that cost more than everything Britta owned combined. He was 51 years old, the dominant landowner in the northern part of the county, a man who had spent 6 years accumulating neighboring parcels from settlers who had failed or given up or died. He had made Christopher an offer for the claim in January, 3 weeks before the blizzard that killed him. Christopher had refused. After the funeral, Steck had come to Britta with the same offer. $40 for the quarter section, the cabin, and all improvements. She had refused then. He had come back twice since with the same offer at the same price, and she had refused both times, and now he sat on his expensive horse in August and looked at her with the patient expression of a man who has decided that time is doing his work for him. I want to make you another offer, he said, $50. That is 10 more than before. The sheep are not for sale. She said, thinking of the cattle, the precedent of a different story and a different version of the same country. The claim, he said gently, not livestock. The claim. $50 is enough to get you back to Minnesota on the train, enough for several months of rent while you find work. Those children could attend a real school. They could have warm beds and regular meals. He spread his hands in a gesture of generosity. You have until November. Think about it. She said nothing. After November, the price goes down. He said it pleasantly as if it were simply practical information. Every month you wait, I will offer less. By January, you will be begging me to take this place for $20. He paused. Assuming you are still alive in January. He rode north. Britta watched him until he was a line against the horizon, then turned back to the work that was always waiting. Sigrid Holte came the next morning to borrow salt. She was 44, a practical woman with several children and a husband who spent months at a time away buying cattle. She ran her operation with the focused efficiency of someone who has learned that sentiment and practicality cannot occupy the same space when winter is coming, and she looked at the world through that lens even when it made her seem harder than she was. When Britta explained the idea, Sigrid set down her coffee cup and looked at her the way a reasonable person looks at someone who has said something that doesn't quite connect to the known world. A circular wall, Sigrid said, of hay, around the cabin and the woodshed together. 8 feet high, 2 feet thick, about 50 feet across. Hay burns. The wall will be 15 feet from the cabin. The stove is inside the cabin. The only fire is inside the stove. She had thought about this. The wind will tear it apart, not if I stake it properly and lash it with rope. The round shape means the wind flows around it. There's no flat surface for pressure to build against. Sigrid was quiet for a moment. She looked out the window at the prairie, at the grass bending and recovering in the constant wind, the way it always did, bending and recovering, as if the wind were asking it a question it could never quite answer. And if it doesn't work, Sigrid said, you will have spent a month of labor and wasted your entire hay supply, and your children will freeze. You are gambling their lives on something you saw from a window. I am gambling their lives, Britta said, because I have no other choice. She spread her hands flat on the table. I have $3. I have 2 children. I have 12 loads of hay and the ability to cut cottonwood stakes in 5 weeks before the ground freezes. Tell me what else I can do. Sigrid had no answer. She took her salt and rode home. The idea had come to Britta on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of a windstorm that had lasted 2 days. She was standing at the cabin's single window watching the prairie grass flatten under gusts that shook the walls and found every gap in the boards and made the stove work twice as hard to hold the temperature at a number that was not dangerous. She had been standing there for 20 minutes, not thinking exactly, just watching, when she noticed the cattle. A quarter-mile to the east, a small herd of 8 or 10 animals had gathered in a tight circle. They stood with their heads down and their rumps to the wind, pressed so close together that their bodies formed something almost solid, and the grass inside their circle was barely moving. She could see it from where she stood. The prairie grass outside the cattle was flat against the ground in the 40-mile wind. The grass inside the circle stood nearly upright. She watched for an hour. The cattle did not move. The wind did not diminish. The circle held. She thought about the cabin. It had 4 flat walls. When the northwest wind struck the north wall, it built pressure against the entire surface and drove cold air through every crack and gap and joint. The wall did not deflect anything. It simply absorbed the full force of the wind and transmitted it into the interior as cold and infiltration and heat loss that no stove could match. But a circle had no flat surfaces. A circle forced the wind to split and flow around the curve the way water split and flowed around a stone in a river. Inside the cattle's circle, the air was calm, not because the wind had diminished, but because the wind had been redirected. The cattle had not stopped the wind. They had changed its shape. What if she built a wall around the cabin? Not a flat wall, a circular wall, 8 feet high, 2 feet thick, built from the prairie hay she had in the stack behind the lean-to barn. She could drive wooden stakes into the ground and pile hay against them, lash it with rope to keep the wind from tearing it apart section by section. The hay would block the wind the way the cattle blocked it. The circular shape would prevent pressure from building against any single surface. And inside the circle, she could stack her firewood where the wind could not reach it, where the snow could not bury it, where it would stay dry and accessible all winter. Her firewood would stay dry. The cabin walls would stop losing heat to the constant wind. The stove that could barely hold 35 degrees in a storm might actually reach 60. One wall, 3 problems solved, built from grass and stakes and rope. She did the math in her head. A circle 50 feet across would give her room for the cabin and the woodshed, with clearance on all sides. That was roughly 157 feet of circumference. At 2 feet thick and 8 feet high, she would need stakes every 3 feet. 2 rings of them, inner and outer. 100 stakes, maybe 112. She had no idea how much hay it would take. She had never built anything larger than a fence post in her life. She had never heard of anyone building anything like this. But she could calculate what she needed for the frame. She could cut the stakes herself from the cottonwood stand in the river bottom 12 miles south, the same place Christopher had gone for firewood. The rope would be expensive, more than she had. But she knew who sold rope on credit in Miller. She went to find her axe. The first trip to the river bottom took 2 full days. She left Solveig and Eric with Sigrid Holte before dawn and drove the ox wagon south through darkness that had not fully lifted by the time she reached the cottonwood stand. She had a handsaw and the axe and a length of rope for bundling, and she spent the first day cutting saplings from the stand, selecting the straightest ones, limbing them, cutting them to 6-foot lengths. She drove home in the dark and arrived after midnight and slept 4 hours and went back the next morning. By the third trip, she knew how to do it efficiently. She knew which trees to select and how to position herself for the cut, and how to bundle them for transport without losing half the load on the ruts and rises of the wagon road. She had become, without planning, to a woman who knew how to cut cottonwood stakes. On the third trip, rushing to finish, before the light failed, the axe slipped. The blade caught the wood at an angle and glanced, and the momentum brought it down across her left palm. She felt the impact before she felt the pain. She looked at her hand. The gash ran from the base of her thumb to the heel of her hand. It was deep enough that she could see the white of tendon before the blood covered it. She did not make a sound. There was no one to hear it, and she had learned in the winter of 1879 to 1880 that sound was something she reserved for moments when it could help. She clenched her fist, pressed it against her thigh, and counted to 20 while the blood soaked through her dress. Then she tore a strip from the petticoat she was wearing, wrapped the hand tightly, and picked up the axe with her right hand. She cut 11 more saplings before she allowed herself to stop. The wound took 2 weeks to close properly. It left a scar that ached when the temperature dropped, which in Dakota territory meant it ached for most of the year. But she had her stakes, she had her frame. She had the material for the one thing standing between her grandchildren and the winter that was coming. By the end of September, she had driven all 112 stakes into the ground in a perfect circle around the cabin and woodshed. The circle was 52 feet in diameter. The stakes were spaced 3 feet apart, the outer ring driven 18 inches into the ground, the inner ring 2 feet inside the first. The outer ring would hold the main body of the hay wall. The inner ring would anchor the rope, lashing that would keep the wall from separating in high wind. She had cut the stakes herself. She had driven them herself with a sledgehammer borrowed from Sigrid Holto, working section by section around the circle over 2 weeks of morning and afternoon labor, with Solveig holding the measuring rope taut and Eric cheering when each stake was seated. The stakes had cost her nothing but time and the scar on her left hand. The rope was a different matter. She had gone to the general store in Miller and purchased $47 worth of manila rope on credit, promising to pay after the spring wheat harvest that might or might not come. $47 she did not have secured against a harvest she could not guarantee for a construction that no one believed would work. She had risked more than she owned. Harmon Steck came on the second day of stake driving and watched her work for 10 minutes before he spoke. Building a fence, he said from his horse. A windbreak, she said. Out of hay, out of what I have. He laughed. He had a way of laughing that contained exactly the amount of warmth he calculated was needed for the moment and nothing more. I have seen men in this territory try to grow wheat in sand and build houses from buffalo dung and dig wells where there is no water. But I have never in all my years seen anyone try to stop a Dakota blizzard with a pile of dead grass. She drove the next stake. The sledgehammer rang on the cottonwood. That hay will rot, he said. It will collapse the first time the wind gets above 30 miles per hour. It will scatter from here to the Missouri River, and you will be standing in your nightdress, watching your shelter blow away across the prairie. Is there something you want, Mr. Steck? I want to offer you a fair price for this claim before winter makes the decision for you. $50. He said it the way he said everything related to money, with the inflection of a man being generous. I feel sorry for you, a woman your age alone, 2 little children, no husband, to do the heavy work. She drove the next stake. No, think carefully. After November, the price goes down. He gathered his reins. By January, assuming you are still alive in January, I will offer you $20 and call it charity. He rode north. She watched him go for the amount of time it took to locate her next position, then turned back to the stakes. Her hands were shaking. She was not sure whether from anger or cold or exhaustion, or the particular fear that comes from being told by a man who might be right that everything you are doing will fail. She picked up the sledgehammer and drove the next stake, then the next one. By the 10th of October, the hay wall was 1/3 complete. The northern arc, the section facing the prevailing northwest wind, rose 8 feet high and 2 feet thick, curving around the cabin's north face in a curve that she could see from inside the circle had already changed the air. When the wind blew from the northwest, as it did for hours every day, the space near the cabin walls was nearly still. She could light a candle outside the cabin door and watch it burn without flickering. She had proved to herself at least that the shape worked. And then she ran out of hay. She sat on the cabin step that evening and looked at the incomplete wall. The northern arc stood solid and dense, and exactly as she had planned it. But the southern and eastern sides of the circle were open prairie. Nothing between the wind and the cabin but air. She had underestimated. The 12 loads she had cut in August were not enough. She needed 8 more loads, maybe 10 pounds, and there was no time to cut them. The first hard freeze could arrive any day. Once the ground hardened, she could not drive additional stakes. Once the snow came, she could not see the grass to cut it. She sat with this for a long time. She thought about Pierre riding away without looking back after telling her the children would die first. She thought about Eric on the night of the last winter, the silence of him in her arms at 3 in the morning, the silence that meant the body was considering whether to continue. She thought, if I fail now, who will rub his arms? Who will breathe on his face? Who will talk to him in Norwegian until the sun comes up? She stood up. She did not have an answer, but she stood up because sitting was not going to produce one. She went inside to make dinner for the children. She moved carefully in the small space, favoring the right foot the way she always did now, without thinking about it. She fed the stove. She fed the children. She put them to bed. And then she sat at the table in the dark and thought about who in this county had hay she might be able to borrow or buy on credit she did not have. She was still sitting there when she heard boots on the cabin step. She opened the door. Sigrid Holta stood in the October evening air, her breath visible in the cold, her arms crossed over her coat. She had walked the 2 miles from her claim in the dark. She looked past Britta at the incomplete wall, studying the northern arc in the last of the light. You are short, Sigrid said. I know. How much? 8 loads. maybe 10. Sigurd was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of coming cold. I have hay, Sigurd said finally. We cut more than we need for the animals this year. 14 loads in the big stack behind the barn. Britta looked at her. You said this was foolish, she said. You said I was gambling the children's lives. I said it was a gamble. Sigurd's voice had the particular texture of a woman being careful with a conclusion she has arrived at against her own previous judgment. I have been watching you work for 3 weeks. Every morning I look east and see you driving stakes or forking hay. You have not stopped. You have not complained. She walked to the northern arc of the wall and pressed her palm against it, feeling the density of the packed hay. You drove stakes until your hands bled and kept driving. She held her hand against the wall for a moment. I still do not know if this will work, she said. Maybe the wind will tear it apart. Maybe Steck is right, but I have never seen anyone work harder for anything in my life. If you fail, it will not be because you did not try. She turned back to face Britta. I cannot pay you, Britta said. I am not asking for money. I am asking you to help me butcher 2 hogs in November. 3 days of work. Sigurd looked at the arc of the wall one more time. My husband says I am soft for lending to lost causes, she said. But my husband is 200 miles away buying cattle, and I make my own decisions when he is gone. She turned and walked back into the dark toward her own claim. The hay arrived the next morning, 10 loads hauled in 3 wagon trips by Sigurd's oldest son, who stacked without being asked and left without saying a word. By October the 14th, the wall was complete, 8 feet tall, 2 feet thick. Perfect circle of compressed prairie hay lashed to 112 cottonwood stakes with $47 of manila rope that Britta did not have. It stood in the October light looking like nothing that had ever existed on the open Dakota prairie, which was true. Inside the circle, the air was calm. Britta stood at the center exactly between the cabin and the woodshed, and for the first time since May, since before she had come to this claim, since before her son had ridden south for Firewood and not come back, she could not feel the wind on her face. It was working. She did not celebrate. There was no time and no one to celebrate with, and the real test had not yet come. She checked the rope lashings one more time, tightening where she could. She verified the clearance between the wall and the woodpile. She checked everything she could think of to check. Then she went inside. She fed the stove. She made dinner. She put Solveig and Eric to bed, kissing Solveig's forehead, and then Eric's holding her hand on Eric's forehead, a moment longer than necessary feeling for warmth that should not be there. He was fine. He was warm the way a sleeping child is warm, which is the good kind, the kind that means the body is doing what it is supposed to do. She stood at the window and looked at the hay wall in the starlight. The compressed prairie grass gold in the daylight was silver now, the stalks catching the light from a sky that was hard and clear, the way Dakota skies got before weather moved in. Anders, she said softly, using her son's name in the dark for the first time since the funeral. She said it quietly, not to call him, just to say it because the wall was something she wanted him to know about, even though the knowing was not possible. She had built it from the claim he had died reaching. She had built it from the grass he had walked through every day without looking at. She had built it from the instinct that a herd of cattle had shown her on an August afternoon, and it was standing, and tomorrow it would be tested, and she had done everything she could do. She went to bed. Outside, the sky was doing something she did not see, a darkening on the northwestern horizon that was building slowly toward the morning, taking its time the way the worst weather always took its time before it arrived all at once. The first blizzard of the hard winter was 9 hours away. Britta Sundvall slept. Eric woke in the night coughing. It was a small sound at first, dry and sharp, the kind of cough that a child makes when the air is cold and the throat is dry. Britta was awake before the second one, the particular alertness of a person whose nervous system has been recalibrated by experience to treat certain sounds as emergencies. She crossed to the bed and pressed her palm to his forehead. The skin was hot, not sleep-warm, not the warmth of a child buried under blankets, the dry, radiating heat of fever. She pressed again to be certain. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and held his hand and thought about what this meant and what she had available to address it. She had willow bark dried and stored since summer. She had the knowledge her mother had given her in Norway 30 years ago, passed through hands that had tended children in farmhouses through long cold seasons. She had the stove and the pot and the ability to make steam. She had everything she needed for the fever itself. What she did not have was a doctor within 22 miles. What she did not have was the ability to leave the children and ride for help. What she did not have was the certainty that the wall surrounding the cabin would hold through what the sky was preparing to deliver. She got up and started the stove and put water on to boil. The storm arrived at 2 in the afternoon on October the 15th. It did not build gradually. It did not announce itself with a change in wind direction or a deepening of clouds or any of the warning signs that a patient observer might have caught in time to prepare further. It arrived like a wall, one moment the air outside the cabin still and gray with overcast, and the next moment a sound like a freight locomotive filled the world, and the entire structure shuddered as though struck by something enormous. Britta was at the stove with the willow bark tea when it hit. She grabbed the pot before it could slide. She stood still for 3 seconds, feeling the cabin respond to the impact of the wind, feeling the walls flex and settle in a way that confirmed everything Halvor Bjerre had said about thin lumber and no windbreak. Then she looked at the thermometer. 34 degrees outside, falling. She fed the stove. She checked Eric, who was sleeping with the shallow, rapid breathing of a fever that had not broken. She settled Solveig beside him with instructions to call out if anything changed, and then she began the work of preparing for what was coming. She moved firewood inside armload after armload, from the stack inside the circle to the space beside the stove until there was no more room, and she had to start stacking against the wall. She filled every pot and bucket and vessel she owned with water from the well, because the well might become unreachable before the storm ended. She stuffed fresh rags into the worst of the board gaps where she could feel the cold air bleeding in. She checked the rope lashing on the stovepipe where it exited through the roof. Then she closed the door and barred it and settled in to manage what she had. By nightfall, the temperature outside had reached 18 below zero. The wind had not slowed. If anything, it had strengthened, finding some additional reserve of fury in the darkness, screaming across the open prairie, in the way that Dakota wind screamed, not the variable gusting of lesser storms, but a sustained, continuous roar that did not pause or vary, that simply was the same note held for hours without break. The tar paper on the exterior of the cabin tore loose in strips, each one going with a sound like a gunshot that made Solveig flinch even in her sleep. Britta fed the stove every 20 minutes. She pushed in more wood than she would normally burn in an hour, watching the flames roar in the firebox, feeling the cast iron radiate heat that spread perhaps 4 feet from the stove and went no further. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped from the 41 degrees of the previous evening to 35, then to 32. Then it stabilized, hovering at the edge of freezing, neither improving nor worsening as she maintained the fire at its maximum output. She understood what this meant. The stove was not winning. The stove was holding even. The wind outside was pulling heat through the walls and the gaps in the thin boards as fast as the fire could produce it, and the two forces were in balance at 32 degrees, which was survivable but not sustainable through a 5-day storm on a fuel supply that was already running lower than she had planned. But it was 32 degrees. In a normal winter in this cabin, with this wind without any windbreak, she had calculated it would drop to match the outside temperature within a day and a half. The wall was doing something. The wall was not solving the problem entirely, but it was changing the equation enough that the stove could hold. She fed the stove. She checked Eric. She made more willow bark tea and coaxed it into him a spoonful at a time. She pressed cool cloths to his forehead, changing them when the fever heated them through. She did not sleep. The night passed in intervals defined by the stove. 20 minutes of warmth, then the chill creeping back, then another load. Eric's breathing shallow and rapid. Solveig sleeping with the practiced unconsciousness of a child who has learned that the best thing she can do in a crisis is not add to it. The wind constant, in absolute, a presence in the cabin as real as any person pressing against the walls and finding its ways in through every imperfection. At 3 in the morning, Britta sat in the chair beside the stove and felt the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting something that does not tire. She was 62 years old and she had been awake for almost 20 hours, and she had been moving for most of them. Her right foot ached the way it always ached in cold weather, the 4 missing toes making their absence known in a way that she had learned to read as weather information, the body's own barometer. She thought about Bjerre on his gray mare, riding away without looking back. She thought about Stek and his patient smile, and his certainty that winter would do his work for him. She thought about Christopher, who had ridden south for firewood and not come back, who had built this cabin with green lumber, and thought that would be enough, who had been 34 years old and making the same calculations everyone made, and had been wrong about one thing on one day in a way that could not be recovered from. She thought about Eric stopping shivering in the winter of 1879 to 1880, and she stood up and loaded the stove and went to check on him. His forehead was still burning. She sat beside him and held his hand and talked to him in Norwegian, telling him about the farm her parents had kept outside Bergen, about the way the light looked in Norway in summer, about the smell of the sea and the sound of the church bell on Sunday mornings. She talked not because she believed he could hear her, but because the talking kept her awake, and the sound of her voice in the dark was the only thing she had to offer him that was not wood or tea or cloth. She talked until the stove needed loading again. The second day brought something she had not planned for. She ran out of firewood inside the cabin. She had moved 4 armloads in before the storm hit, which had seemed like enough for 2 days at normal consumption. But the consumption was not normal. She had been burning a full load every 20 minutes for 16 hours, and by noon on the second day, the stack beside the stove was down to 3 pieces. The wood pile was inside the hay circle, 50 feet from the cabin door. Under 50 miles per hour, wind and blowing snow with visibility, she estimated at 3 feet, possibly less. People died in these conditions walking between their house and their barn. This was not a figure of speech. She had heard the stories. She had heard Bale tell them with the specificity of a man who had been to the sites and seen the bodies. Men and women found in the spring, frozen, sometimes within arm's reach of the structure they had been trying to reach, disoriented by the whiteout, turned around in the 30 seconds it took to lose all reference. She sat with this for approximately 2 minutes. Then she got up and put on every piece of clothing she owned. She layered her 2 wool skirts and her husband's old coat and her heaviest shawl and wrapped her face in a strip of wool until only her eyes showed. She pulled on her mittens. She tied one end of the rope she kept by the door around her waist and tied the other end to the door handle of the cabin, the iron handle that was bolted through the wood and would not pull free. She had strung a second rope between the cabin door and the woodpile weeks ago, when she had first understood that this moment might come. She had done it the way she had done every other preparation, quietly and without telling anyone, because the doing of it was enough without the explaining. She opened the door. The wind hit her like a physical object, not wind as she had experienced wind before, as something that moved around her and past her, but wind as pressure, as mass, as a force with apparent intention. It hit the left side of her body simultaneously from collar to knee and tried to take her with it. She gripped the door frame with her right hand and got her feet under her and stepped out. The cold was not cold the way she understood cold. It was something past temperature, something that bypassed the body's gradual registering of discomfort and went directly to a kind of mechanical assessment. She breathed in through the wool across her nose and mouth and felt the moisture of her breath freeze against the fabric before she had fully exhaled. She could not see the hay wall. She could not see the woodpile. She could not see the cabin behind her after she took 4 steps away from it. She could not see anything except white moving white, snow driving sideways in a wall that erased all distinction between ground and sky and near and far. She found the strung rope with her right hand and followed it. The hay wall slowed the wind inside the circle. She felt it the moment she passed through the gap she had left for access, a reduction that was not calm, but was survivable, the wind dropping from something that wanted to knock her down to something she could lean into and move through. She followed the rope to the wood pile and grabbed an armload of wood with both hands. The logs were dry. She stood in the Dakota blizzard with an armload of dry cottonwood and understood completely, in a way, that the planning and the building and the months of preparation had not quite made real until this moment what the wall had done. The snow had drifted against the outer base of the circular wall in the way snow always drifted against any obstacle piling up on the windward side. But inside the circle, the wind had been redirected rather than stop flowing around the curve and losing its force, and the snow had not driven horizontally into the woodpile the way it would have without the wall. Small amounts had accumulated on the top surface of the stacked logs, but the individual pieces were separate and grabbable. They were not frozen together. They had not become a single mass like the woodpile in the winter of 1879 to 1880 that she had attacked with an axe for 2 hours and freed 3 sticks from. She could grab them one at a time with her hands. She carried the first load back to the cabin, following the rope, finding the door by feel. The warmth inside hit her like the memory of something she had almost forgotten existed. She dropped the wood beside the stove and went back out. 6 trips, each one the same. The rope, the wall's gap, the reduced wind inside the circle, the dry logs grabbable by hand, the rope back, the door. On the 5th trip, she missed the door on her return and went past it, and her heart did the specific thing it does when you realize you are lost in a whiteout. A sudden compression, a narrowing of thought to the single fact of the rope in your hand. She followed it backward 3 steps and found the doorframe and went in. On the 6th trip, she stopped at the woodpile and stood for a moment in the partial shelter of the haywall's interior and breathed. She was 62 years old and she had made 6 trips through a Dakota blizzard at 18 below zero with wind at 50 miles per hour, and she was upright and oriented, and her hands were full of dry wood. She went inside. She loaded the stove until the firebox was packed. She sat down in the chair and did not move for 10 minutes, which was the first time she had not moved in approximately 36 hours. Then she got up and checked Eric. His breathing had changed. She heard it before she reached the bed, a difference in the rhythm and the depth that was not dramatic but was real. The rapid, shallow respiration of high fever was slower. The quality of each breath was fuller. She pressed her palm to his forehead and held it there and felt what she felt and pressed again to be sure. Cooler, not normal, not well, but cooler than it had been at midnight, cooler than it had been at 3 in the morning, cooler in the direction that mattered. The fever was moving the right way. She sat beside him and held his hand, and for the first time in 2 days, she allowed herself to stop calculating. She did not think about the woodpile or the stove or the rope or the temperature on the thermometer. She sat with the hand of her 6-year-old grandson and listened to his breathing improve, degree by degree, in the way that recovery came not all at once, but incrementally, the body reasserting itself against whatever had tried to take it over. Solveig woke and looked at her from the other side of the bed. Her face, even in sleep, had been carrying something that 9-year-old faces should not have to carry. Now she looked at her grandmother and read whatever was in Britta's face, and her own face simplified. "Is he better?" Solveig said. "He is getting better," Britta said. Solveig nodded. She reached across the blankets and took her brother's other hand. They sat on either side of him, the old woman and the child, and the stove crackled with the wood Britta had brought in through the storm, and outside the blizzard continued its work on the open prairie. The temperature outside reached 26 below zero on the second night. Inside the cabin, the thermometer read 31 degrees. Cold enough to see your breath. Cold enough that the water in the bucket near the door had a skin of ice on it by morning. But 31 degrees was not 19 degrees. 31 degrees was not the night of the previous winter when Eric had stopped shivering. 31 degrees was survivable in a way that required endurance, but not miracles. The stove held it there. The wall held the stove's ability to hold it there. The circle of prairie grass that a herd of cattle had shown her on a summer afternoon was doing in the worst storm of the season exactly what she had calculated it would do. She burned through her reserves at a rate she had not planned for, faster than her summer estimates had suggested, because the storm was colder and lasted longer than the average she had built her calculations on. By the morning of the 3rd day, she had burned through half her winter's supply of firewood. In a normal year, this would have been a catastrophe, but the firewood that remained was dry and accessible. And the storm, whatever it took from her in fuel, could not turn that remaining wood into a frozen mass she could not reach or split. The wall had separated the problem of the cold from the problem of the fuel, and she had only to manage one at a time. She managed. She fed the stove through the second night with the same rhythm she had established on the first loading, it every 20 to 25 minutes, banking it when the cold outside dropped below what she needed to maintain inside. She slept in the chair in 20-minute intervals between loadings, her internal clock trained by necessity to the stove's schedule. It was not sleep exactly. It was a practiced suspension, the body resting without fully releasing its watch. Between the loadings, she sat with Eric. His fever broke on the morning of the 3rd day, sometime before dawn, while the storm was in its final hours. She woke from one of her chair intervals to find the quality of the air in the cabin different. She went to him and pressed her palm to his forehead and found the skin cool and damp, with the perspiration that follows a fever's breaking. The body cooling itself, the battle ended. He opened his eyes. They focused on her face, really focused, the glazed inward look of high fever gone. He said Baoi, the Norwegian word for grandmother that she had taught him because it was what she was and what the word meant in the language she had carried across an ocean. Then in English, I'm hungry. Britta laughed. It came out as something between a laugh and a sound she could not name, something that had been compressed inside her for 3 days of sustained emergency and that found its exit now that the emergency had passed its worst point. She pressed her hand to her mouth and held it there for a moment. Then she got up and made biscuits. The storm ended on the morning of the fourth day in the way that Dakota storms ended, without apology or transition. The wind simply stopping as if someone had closed a door. The silence that followed was so complete, it had a texture, a positive quality, the world refilling itself with sound from the bottom up. First the creak of the cabin settling, then the distant sound of something blowing loose somewhere across the prairie, then slowly the ordinary sounds of a morning. Britta opened the cabin door. The world outside had been rearranged. Drifts 3 and 4 feet deep on the level ground, 8 and 10 feet where the wind had pushed them against any obstacle. The hay wall visible above the snow line showed the marks of what had hit it. The northwestern face was compressed, the hay packed harder than she had built it, pressed inward by 3 days of sustained force. Several of the rope lashings on that face had been pulled tight enough to have cut into the hay. One stake had shifted slightly outward, but the wall stood, every section of it. 8 feet of prairie grass lashed to cottonwood stakes, and it had held through the worst storm of the season without collapsing. She walked the perimeter, touching each section as she went, checking the lashings, pressing on the stakes, assessing the damage. The northwestern face would need reinforcement before the next storm. 2 of the rope lashings on the west side needed retying. 1 stake needed reseating, otherwise it was intact. She walked to the woodpile. The logs were stacked exactly as she had left them. The snow had drifted against the outside of the wall to the north and northwest, and some had come over the top and settled on the pile's surface. But the individual logs were discrete in separate frost on the outer surfaces, but not frozen together, not locked into a single immovable mass. She picked up a log with one hand. She stood in the aftermath of the worst storm of the Dakota winter of 1880 and held a piece of dry firewood in one hand. Then she looked out beyond the wall. To the north, a quarter-mile away, the dark shape of Harmon Stake's sawmill house stood above the drifts. In front of it, she could see what had been his woodpile, a mountain of white, now the entire stack buried under a drift that had built against the flat north wall of his storage shed and risen above the roofline. Even from this distance, she could see the shovel, the figure of a man, attacking the frozen mass. He had been digging for hours. She could tell from the size of the excavation he had made and from the pace of the digging, which was the pace of exhaustion rather than the pace of a man who has just begun. She looked at the firewood in her hand. She looked at the intact wall of hay that surrounded her cabin and woodshed. She put the firewood down and went inside to feed her grandchildren breakfast. Sigrid Holte appeared on the 5th day, riding through snow that was chest-high on her horse in the low spots. She came from the south with her coat buttoned and her face raw from cold, and her eyes doing the particular work of a woman arriving somewhere and not yet knowing what she will find. She stopped outside the gap in the hay wall and looked at the structure from the outside. She rode around it once, which took some time because of the drifts, examining the northwestern face that the storm had compressed, looking at the sections that remained unchanged, looking at the crown of the wall above the drift line where the lashings were visible. Then she came through the gap and stopped her horse in the interior of the circle. The air inside was different from the air outside. Not warm, but still. The absence of wind in a landscape that had been defined by wind for 3 days gave the interior of the circle a quality that was almost uncanny, a stillness that felt earned. She dismounted and walked to the woodpile. She picked up a log and turned it over in her hands. She held it for a moment, set it down. She walked to the cabin door and knocked. When Britta opened it, Sigrid looked at the thermometer on the interior wall. 35 degrees. She looked at the stove burning steadily, the children beside it eating the biscuits that Britta had made when Eric's fever broke. She looked at Eric's face, which was thin from the fever, but present in the way that a recovered face was present, the full engagement of a person no longer fighting something internal. "Your boy," Sigrid said. "He is better," Britta said. Sigrid nodded. She stood in the cabin doorway for a moment with her hands in her coat pockets. Something was working in her face that she did not fully try to hide. The Lindstrom family lost their milk cow, she said finally. She froze in the barn because the walls were not thick enough. Their wood pile was outside any shelter. It is a frozen block. I do not know how they will manage. She looked at the hay wall through the open cabin door, the curve of it visible from where she stood. My own woodpile froze, she said. She said it the way a practical woman says something she finds informative rather than devastating, filing it away as data. I lost 2 days getting into it. My hands. She looked at her hands briefly. Britta said nothing. She waited. I was wrong, Sigrid said. She said it simply without surrounding language, the way a practical woman acknowledged a factual error. The wall did what you said it would do. Your wood stayed dry. Your children survived in a cabin that everyone in this county, including me, told you would kill them. She paused. I am glad I was wrong. She took something from her coat pocket and held it out. A burlap sack. Inside it, moving with the indignation of hens who have been transported against their will, were 3 laying chickens. They're producing, she said. Not much, but something. You will have eggs through the rest of winter. She set the sack carefully against the cabin wall where the chickens would have some shelter. She looked at Britta. I don't know how you did it, she said, at your age alone with the children. But you did it. She mounted her horse and rode south through the drifts, her figure growing small against the white landscape, and then disappearing into the tree line where the creek bent east. Britta watched her go. Then she looked at the hay wall, at the compressed northwestern face, at the lashings that had held through 3 days of 50-mile wind, at the stakes driven by her own hands through weeks of 14-hour days, with a sledgehammer borrowed from a neighbor who had told her it would not work. She went back inside. There was reinforcement to do on the northwestern face before the next storm came. There were lashings to retighten and a stake to reseat, and a section of wall that needed additional hay packed against the outer face where the compression had reduced the thickness below 2 feet. She had calculated, based on what the storm had shown her about the wall's performance, 3 specific improvements she wanted to make before the next hard weather arrived. And the Lindstrom family had lost their woodpile. She had been thinking about that since Sigrid mentioned it. The Lindstroms had children. They had a barn, which meant they had hay. She had $47 of rope still lashed around her stakes and the knowledge of how to use it. She would go to them in a week when the roads were passable. She would bring the measurements and the method and the principle that a herd of cattle had shown her on a summer afternoon, and she would help them build what she had built, and she would charge them nothing for the knowledge because knowledge was not the kind of thing that diminished when you shared it. But first, the wall needed reinforcing. She put on her coat and her mittens and went out into the cold. The air inside the circle was still. The woodpile stood dry and accessible along the south face of the woodshed. The hay wall rose 8 feet above the snow line, slightly battered on the northwest, intact on every other face. She began with the lashings. She worked from the northwestern face clockwise, testing each rope in turn, retying where the storm had pulled the knots loose, adding a second lashing above the first where the compression had reduced the wall's cross-section. She worked with the focused efficiency of a person who has done a thing so many times that the body performs it without requiring direction from the mind, the hands finding the knots in the stakes and the angles automatically, while the mind worked on the next problem. The next problem was the stake. She found it on the western arc, a cottonwood post, that the storm had shifted 2 inches outward from its original position, the ground around it disturbed by repeated cycles of freezing and thawing during the storm's duration. She packed the disturbed earth back in with her foot tamping it solidly, then drove the stake back to true with the sledgehammer she kept inside the circle for exactly this purpose. Then she packed additional hay against the northwestern face from the inside working fork, load by fork load, compressing it against the existing wall until the thickness was back to 2 feet along the entire damaged section. She worked until the light began to fail. Then she put up the tools and went inside. Eric was sitting up when she came in. He was thin from the fever, and his eyes were slightly larger than usual in the way of a face that has lost weight. But he was sitting up, and he was present, and he was asking Solveig to play the card game they had been playing since Minnesota using a deck that their mother had bought in St. Paul, and that had survived the journey west inside a tin box. Solveig was dealing with the practiced efficiency of a 9-year-old who has been the responsible one for so long it has become simply who she is. They looked up when Britta came in, two children looking at their grandmother, coming through the door of a cabin that had held 31 degrees through the worst blizzard of the season, in the aftermath of a storm that had frozen solid the woodpiles of every neighbor within 5 miles. Sit down, Baoi Solveig said, using the Norwegian word as naturally as if it were her first language, which in some sense it was. You have been working all day. Britta sat down. She watched her grandchildren play their card game in the lamplight. And outside, the haywall held the stillness of the interior against whatever the prairie night intended to deliver. And the stove burned the dry cottonwood she had carried in through the storm, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, there was nothing immediate requiring her to stand up. She sat. She was still sitting there when the children fell asleep, the cards scattered across the blanket between them. Both of them gone under in the way of children who have been frightened and are now safe deeply and completely and without reservation. She fed the stove. She sat back down. Outside, somewhere across the open prairie, the next storm was building. It was always building. This was Dakota Territory in the winter of 1880, and the hard winter had barely started, and there were 4 months remaining before the ground would soften enough to think about spring. But her woodpile was dry. Her grandchildren were asleep. The wall was standing. She fed the stove again and sat with her hands in her lap and let herself rest. Halvor Bjerre came on the 4th day after the storm. Britta saw him from the window, his gray mare moving through drifts that reached the animal's chest in the low spots, picking a careful path along the ridgelines where the snow had blown thinner. He rode the way he always rode, unhurried, with the economy of motion of a man who had learned to conserve everything in a country that taxed everything. He came from the west, which meant he had ridden 3 miles through aftermath that most men would have waited another week to attempt. She went outside to meet him. He stopped the mare at the gap in the haywall and sat for a full minute without dismounting. He looked at the wall, the way he looked at everything, slowly and completely, without the performance of assessment, but with the real thing. He rode around it the full circumference, examining the compressed northwestern face and the intact southern and eastern arcs, in the lashings that had held, in the stakes that had not shifted. He looked at the firewood stacked dry along the woodshed wall. He looked at the cabin, its stovepipe trailing pale smoke into the cold morning air. Then he dismounted and walked through the gap and stood in the interior. He pressed his palm against the hay wall. He held it there for a long moment, feeling the density of the compressed grass, the resistance of it, the way it gave slightly under pressure, and then stopped. He walked to the woodpile and looked at it without touching it. He looked at the individual logs, separate in grabbable frost on the outer surfaces, but not bonded together. He turned to face her. Your children, he said. Live, Britta said. Eric had a fever. It broke on the 3rd morning. Bjerre nodded. He looked at the wall again, at the sky above it, at the northwestern face that the storm had worked on most severely. How cold did it get inside, he said. 31 degrees at the lowest. The second night. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the thermometer she had nailed to the exterior of the cabin, which currently read 12 below zero. I burned 3 cords in October, he said, in my cabin, with the sod banking I put in every fall and the firewood I stacked inside the barn. 3 cords in 1 month. He paused. How much did you burn? She told him. Less than half a cord through the 4 days of the storm. She had counted. Bjerre closed his eyes. He stood in the center of the hay circle with his eyes closed and his arms at his sides, and Britta watched him and did not speak. She had learned in 62 years that certain silences were not empty. They were full of something that needed space to finish becoming what it was going to be. When he opened his eyes, they were wet at the rims. He walked back to the hay wall and pressed his palm against it again. He kept it there this time, not testing, not assessing, just holding. I told you this cabin would kill you, he said. His voice had the flat, abraded quality of a man saying something that cost him something real. I told you the children would die first. I told you the wind would freeze your firewood, and then it would freeze you. He looked at his hand against the wall. I buried Eric in 73. I buried Gunnar in 76. I have spent 11 winters understanding what this prairie does to people who are not ready for it. I thought I understood everything it could do. He paused. I did not understand this. He took his hand off the wall. This week, he said, I helped bury 3 families. People with proper cabins, people who had banked their foundations and stacked their firewood and done every correct thing that I or anyone else had told them to do. They froze when their woodpiles became unreachable. He looked at the dry logs along the woodshed wall. Their firewood was 20 feet from their doors, and they could not get to it. He turned to face her fully. "You built a circle of grass," he said, "and your firewood stayed dry, and your children are alive." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong. I am sorry I was wrong." Britta said nothing. There was nothing to say that the wall had not already said more eloquently. Bale reached into his coat and produced a small notebook, the kind he used for tally counts and weather records. He opened it to a blank page. "Tell me everything," he said. "Every measurement, every technique, the stake spacing, the rope intervals, the thickness, how you handled the gaps, how the shape affects the wind on the inside." He held the pencil ready. "I am going to ride through this county and tell every family that will listen. There is another storm coming within the week. Some of them still have time," she told him. She took him around the circle and showed him the stake positioning and the double ring and the way the rope lashings crossed between the rings to prevent the wall from bowing outward under wind pressure. She showed him the gap left for access and the way she had positioned it on the eastern face away from the prevailing wind direction. She showed him the spacing she had maintained between the wall and the cabin and the woodpile. She explained the depth the stakes needed to be driven to remain stable through freeze-thaw cycles. She explained the minimum thickness that would block wind versus snow versus the combination of both in a sustained storm. Bierry wrote everything in his small notebook with the careful hand of a man who understands that he is recording something that will matter. He stayed 2 hours. When he left, he stopped his horse at the mop and turned back to look at her one final time. "You watched cattle," he said. "You built what you saw." "Yes," he nodded slowly. "I have watched cattle for 40 years, he said. He did not say anything else. He rode west toward his own claim and toward the families he intended to visit before the next storm arrived. Britta watched him go. Then she went inside to make lunch for the children. Harmon's Steck came in February. He had lost 2 toes on his left foot to frostbite in December when his woodpile had frozen for the 3rd time, and he had spent 4 hours in 20 below zero attacking it with a pickaxe. He had lost another one in January during the storm that the newspapers would later call by a name that described what it had done to the schools and the children who had been caught outside in it. 3 toes in 4 months. He walked differently now, with a deliberateness that was not quite a limp, but was the compensation of a man whose body had been permanently changed by something he had underestimated. He came on a Thursday afternoon in February when the cold had eased slightly, the temperature at only 5 below, which in the context of that winter felt almost mild. He came alone without the horse that had cost more than everything she owned, walking the quarter-mile from the road on foot, through snow that was still knee-deep in places. He stopped at the outer face of the hay wall and stood looking at it. He looked at it for a long time, the full circumference that was visible from where he stood, the weathered hay that had compressed further through 4 months of winter into something denser than she had built and more solid than she had expected. Britta came out when she saw him from the window. He was thinner than he had been in August. His face had the particular quality of a man who has spent a winter being wrong about something consequential. The hollowness around the eyes that comes not from cold, but from the sustained work of revising a belief that had been held with confidence. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the wall and then at the cabin behind it, and then at the smoke rising from the stovepipe, and then at the ground. "I told you this wall would scatter from here to the Missouri River," he said finally. "I remember. I told you the hay would rot." He listed them the way a man lists his debts, methodically giving each one its full weight. "I told you that you would be standing in your nightdress watching your shelter blow away. I told you that by January you would be begging me to take this place for $20. He looked up. Instead, he said, "My woodpile froze 3 times and yours did not freeze once. My cabin nearly killed me and yours kept your grandchildren alive through the worst winter in 11 years. He was quiet for a moment. "I came to apologize," he said, "and to ask if you would teach me to build what you have built." Britta studied him. She remembered his smile in August when he had predicted her death. She remembered the patience in his voice when he described how the price would drop each month, the calculation behind it, the certainty that winter would eventually compel her to sell. She remembered standing at the stakes with her hands shaking and not being sure if it was anger or fear. She looked at the hay wall. She looked at the marks the winter had left on it, the compression on the northwestern face, The darkening of the hay where weather had worked it, the rope lashings that had held through everything the season had delivered. She looked at the woodpile, reduced but still substantial, dry and accessible all winter long. The Andersons on the east claim, she said. Do you know them? Steck looked at her. He had not expected this. Yes, they have 4 children under 8. Their woodpile froze in November, and they have been burning furniture since December. They do not have enough hay stacked for a full wall, but they have enough for 3/4 of one, and 3/4 is better than nothing. You will help them build it before you build yours. He stared at her. After what I said to you, he said. After what I tried to do. Why would you help me at all? Britta looked at the wall her son had intended to build and had not lived to build, and that she had built instead from grass and rope and the observation of a herd of cattle on a summer afternoon. Because this is not about you and me, she said. This is about surviving, all of us together. That is the only way anyone makes it through a Dakota winter. If the Andersons freeze and you freeze and your neighbors freeze, it does not matter how warm my cabin is. We are in this together or we are not in it at all. Steck looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once without additional language. He helped the Andersons the following week. He worked for 4 days at their claim driving stakes and hauling hay and retying lashings in the cold with the focused labor of a man repaying something. The Anderson family's wall was not complete when the February storm hit, but the section that was complete, the northern and northwestern arc, kept their woodpile dry enough that they could reach it. They survived the storm with fuel to spare. Steck built his own wall in March when the worst of the winter had passed, but before the spring thaw made the work unnecessary. He built it with the measurements and the technique that Bale had given him from the notes he had taken in Britta's circle, and he built it properly, the full circumference, the double stake ring, the rope lashings at 18-inch intervals. He was ready for the following winter before the snow from the current one had fully melted. He did not apologize again, but he did not threaten again either. And when newcomers to the county asked him about the hay wall he had seen at the Sunval, claimed he described it accurately and completely and told them where to go to learn how to build one. By spring of 1881, Britta had helped 3 families build walls of their own. The Lindstroms, who had lost their milk cow in the October storm, were first. She rode to their claim on the 2nd day after the roads became passable, bringing the measurements and the principles and spending 2 full days at their claim, helping them locate the cottonwood stand nearest to their property and select the right saplings and begin the stake driving. Their wall was smaller than hers, 40 feet across instead of 52, enclosing only the main house. But it followed the same logic. Circular 2 feet thick rope lashed staked deep. When the second major storm of the winter arrived in late November, the Lindstroms survived it with their woodpile accessible and their cabin holding 34 degrees through the worst of it. A degree colder than Britta's interior during the October storm because the wall was smaller and the insulation principle less complete, but survivable. Clearly demonstrably survivable in a way that their previous situation had not been. A family named Bergstrom came to her claim in February after hearing about the wall from Bale, who had ridden through the county telling people about it after the October storm. The Bergstroms had just arrived from Wisconsin and had filed on a claim 20 miles north. They had heard the stories from Bale and had walked 20 miles in knee-deep snow to see it for themselves. Mr. Bergstrom spent a day looking at the wall and asking questions. He was a thorough man, methodical in the way of someone who has made a significant decision and wants to execute it correctly. He drew diagrams in a small leather journal, measuring angles and distances with the patient precision of someone who intended to reproduce what he was seeing without assistance. You should charge for this, he said before he left. What you have worked out here, the shape and the method, it could save lives across the territory. It is not worth money, Britta said, if people die because they could not pay. Build it right. Tell others. He left with his notebook full of measurements and a small square of the hay wall's compressed grass that she cut for him so he could show people what the final density should feel like. She did not know if he built his wall correctly. She did not know what became of him through the rest of that winter. But she gave him what she had and told him to share it because that was the only accounting that made sense to her. By December of 1881, there were 7 hay walls in the county. By January of 1882, there were 12. They did not all perform equally. 2 collapsed in the terrible storm that came in mid-January, where the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 minutes and the wind reached speeds that no haywall was designed to survive without modification. But even the families whose walls partially failed fared better than those with no protection at all. Even a broken circle was better than 4 flat walls and an open woodpile. At the end of that winter, when the final accounting was made in the informal way that frontier communities kept such accounts through conversation and memory and the testimony of people who had been present, the families who had hay walls that winter lost no members to freezing. The families who did not had lost 4 children and 2 adults across the county. The difference was a circular wall of prairie grass. The technique spread the way useful knowledge spread on the Dakota Prairie. Not through newspapers or government bulletins, not through official channels or institutional endorsement, but person to person in the specific manner of people who have something that works and want their neighbors to have it too, because their neighbor's survival is connected to their own. Bale was its primary carrier. He had the trust of the county in a way that Britta, a relative newcomer, a woman, a person who had been told by everyone, including himself, that she would not survive, did not yet have. He rode through the settlements through that winter and the winter that followed, carrying his notebook with its measurements and diagrams, stopping at every claim he passed, telling the story of the widow with $3 who had watched a herd of cattle and built a fortress from the observation. He told it accurately and without embellishment because Bale was not a man who embellished. He described the principle. He described the stakes and the rope and the 2-foot thickness and the height. He described the circular shape and what it did to wind pressure and why a curve that deflected was more effective than a wall that absorbed. He described the woodpile that had stayed dry through the October storm while every unprotected pile in the county became unreachable. He described what he had felt when he pressed his palm against the hay wall 4 days after the storm and understood that he had been wrong. People listened to Bale because he had earned the right to be listened to in the currency of the frontier, which was survival. When a man who had buried 2 sons told you something had worked, you heard it differently than when a neighbor with a lucky season told you the same thing. The variations began appearing within a season. Families who could not cut enough cottonwood for a full double ring of stakes used a single ring with closer spacing. Families who had more sod than hay built hybrid walls hay on the exterior face and sod packed behind it. Families with larger claims built walls that enclosed not just the cabin and woodshed, but the barn as well, keeping the livestock inside the circle through the worst weeks of winter. None of these variations were as effective as the full original design, but all of them were better than nothing. The principle, once understood, adapted itself to available materials and circumstances because the principle was not about any specific material. It was about shape. A circle deflects. A flat wall absorbs. This was the entire principle, and it fit inside a single sentence, and once you understood it, you could build something useful from whatever you had at hand. The winter of 1887 to 1888 arrived with a severity that made the hard winter of 1880 seem mild in retrospect. Britta was 70 years old. She had rebuilt the wall every autumn for 8 years. The same circle, the same measurements, the same stake positions driven into ground that her feet knew intimately by now, the same rope lashings in the same sequence. Each year, the construction was faster than the year before. Each year, Solveig helped more and directed more, having learned the method with the thoroughness of a person for whom it was not a technique, but a way of understanding the physical world. Each year, Eric, growing from 6 to 14, contributed more of the physical labor, the sledgehammer work, the heavy forking. The wall had become what the claim itself had become, something maintained rather than something built, a living system that required annual renewal and continuous attention, but that had earned its place in the landscape as thoroughly as the cabin or the well or the cottonwood windbreak that Britta had planted along the northern boundary in 1883. On the night of January the 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 minutes. The newspapers would name this storm the Children's Blizzard. 235 people died across the Dakota Prairie in the hours that followed, frozen in their homes when their fuel ran out, lost in the whiteout between buildings that were 30 feet apart, caught outside, in conditions that ended human life in minutes. Teachers and students, farmers checking their livestock, children running between the schoolhouse and the shelter of a barn. 235 in a single night. Britta sat beside her stove and listened to it. She was 70 years old, and her right foot ached in the cold the way it always ached the absence of the four toes she had lost in the winter of 1879 to 1880, registering as presence rather than absence, a constant reminder written into the architecture of her body. She had learned to read the ache as information, an additional instrument alongside the thermometer. It told her things about coming weather that the mercury was sometimes too slow to report. It had been telling her things for 2 days before this storm arrived. She had restacked the woodpile and retightened the wall lashings and verified the stake depth and brought extra hay in for packing the interior face of the northwestern arc, where the storms always hit hardest. She had done all of these things without explaining them to anyone because they were simply the things you did when the foot said what the foot was saying. Now she sat in the warmth of the cabin, 38 degrees inside by the thermometer, with the storm doing outside what it was doing, the worst she had heard in 8 winters of listening, and she fed the stove and was warm. Solveig was 17 now, asleep in the bed, with the complete unconsciousness of a person who trusts the person on watch. Eric was 14, sleeping with the particular depth of a boy whose body was changing faster than he could quite account for, requiring more sleep than the child he had recently been, and not quite requiring the less sleep that the adult he was becoming would eventually need. Britta looked at them. She thought about the night Eric had stopped shivering, the winter of 1879 to 1880, the 3 in the morning darkness, and the specific quality of silence that had come over him. She thought about what she had done and what she had felt doing it, the refusal to interpret the silence as what it was. The talking and the rubbing and the breathing and the waiting for a son she had not been certain would arrive in time. He was 14 years old and asleep in a warm cabin on the worst night in Dakota Territory's recorded history. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Christopher, who had built this cabin with green lumber and died trying to keep it supplied. She thought about what he would think if he could see what she had done with the quarter section he had filed on and the claim he had died reaching. A circle of hay, a principle drawn from the behavior of animals, a method that had spread through the county without his name attached to it, without her name attached to it, without any name attached to it at all. She thought about Bale, who had buried his sons and then ridden through the county in the winter of 1880, telling people about the widow in the circle, carrying the knowledge in his notebook from claim to claim. He had died 2 winters before, peacefully in his sleep, after surviving 18 Dakota winters. He had never stopped telling the story. In his final years, he had told it the way old men tell the stories that have replaced other stories, the ones that superseded what they had previously believed most firmly. He had been wrong, he said, every time he told it, and he was glad he had been wrong. And here is what was true instead. The storm screamed outside the hay wall. Britta fed the stove. She thought about the circle, not its construction, which she knew the way she knew her own hands by now, but its meaning, which she had been thinking about for 8 years and which she had not yet finished understanding. The cattle had shown her the shape. The shape had taught her the principle. The principle had saved her grandchildren, and then the Lindstroms, and then the Andersons, and then the family she would never meet, who had learned from someone, who had learned from someone, who had learned from Bjera, or from Sigrid, or from Steck, who had helped the Andersons, who had helped others. No one called it the Sundvall method. It had no name in any of the agricultural bulletins, or the newspaper accounts of that winter, or the conversations between neighbors at the general store in Miller. It was simply what people did now. What they had learned to do, what you built in autumn, the way you put up hay and split firewood, as ordinary and as essential as any other preparation. She had not sought to name it. She had not sought credit or recognition or any form of acknowledgement beyond the practical one that she had wanted from the beginning, which was to not watch her grandchildren die while she was still standing. That want had been satisfied 8 years ago and had continued being satisfied every winter since. She fed the stove and sat back in the chair and listened to the blizzard work itself out against the hay wall, which deflected what it could not be asked to stop, which was the correct relationship between a wall and a storm, and which had held through 8 winters of Dakota weather without failing in any way that could not be addressed with a morning's work and fresh lashings. Outside, 235 people were dying. Inside, her grandchildren breathed in sleep. Spring came to Fergus County the way it always came, tentatively at first, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes before it conceded the flats, the mud arriving as a relief after months of frozen ground, the cottonwoods putting out the first tentative green along the creek bottoms. Britta walked her wall in the early March thaw, pressing on each stake, testing each lashing, assessing the winter's damage with the practiced attention of someone who has been doing this long enough that the wall has become familiar, the way a person becomes familiar, known at a level beyond description. The hay would need to be replaced on the northwestern face, where 8 winters of compression had reduced it below the minimum effective thickness. She would need to cut fresh stakes for 4 positions where the wood had softened in the ground. 2 of the rope lashings had frayed enough to require replacing with new cord. These were the expected repairs. The wall had performed as it was designed to perform. The accounting of the winter was as it had been for 8 years, written in the negative space of what had not happened. The grandchildren had not frozen. The firewood had not become unreachable. The stove had not lost the battle with the wind. The cabin had held. She stood in the center of the circle in the March thaw, the snow retreating from the area inside the wall faster than from the open prairie beyond it, because the wall blocked the wind that would otherwise have kept the temperature below freezing, and she looked at the sky above her. Clear. The particular clear of early spring in Dakota, a blue that had a depth to it that the winter sky lacked, as if the cold had compressed the atmosphere, and the warming was expanding it back towards something more generous. Eric came out of the cabin. He was moving toward 14 the way boys moved at that age, in sudden expansions that surprised everyone, including himself. And he had Christopher's shoulders, now the same breadth that Britta remembered in her son's frame, the same particular quality of physical confidence that came from a body that had been worked hard and had responded. He stopped beside her in the center of the circle. He looked at the wall. He had been looking at it his whole life, which was not very long, but which was all the life he had. And in that life, the wall was as normal and as essential as the cabin, or the well, or the sky above the Dakota prairie. Baoi, he said. He said it the way he had always said it, the Norwegian word worn into the shape of his mouth through 10 years of use, natural and precise. How long will you build it? She looked at the hay wall. She looked at the marks 8 winters had left on it, the compression and the weathering and the particular color that aged prairie grass took on when it had been compressed and exposed and compressed again through years of weather. As long as I need to, she said. And then you will. Eric looked at the wall. He was 14 years old, and he had almost died in this circle when he was 6, and he had no memory of it, only the scar on the tip of his left ear that his grandmother had explained to him once, and that he had stopped thinking about because scars became ordinary. He did not know what it had cost her to build what surrounded him. He knew only that it was there the way you knew the walls of the house you grew up in, as a given as the shape of the world. Teach me, he said, all of it, the measurements and the stakes and the rope intervals, and why the circle instead of a square. Britta looked at him. She thought about her mother teaching her to wrap wool in Norway in a farmhouse kitchen that no longer existed in a country she had not seen in 30 years. She thought about the hands of a woman who had been dead for decades, moving through a motion that had passed through Britta's hands and now needed to pass again. She walked to the northwestern arc and put her palm flat against the wall. Start here, she said. This face. It has taken the most damage because the wind comes from the northwest. You learn the worst section first because the worst section is where the wall matters most. Eric came and stood beside her. She put his hand against the wall beside hers and showed him what she was feeling for the density in the center of the section versus the compression at the edges, the way the winter had worked on it differently depending on the angle of impact. She showed him what adequate felt like and what inadequate felt like, the knowledge in the hands that could not be transmitted any other way. He felt what she was pointing at. She could tell from the change in his expression the specific quality of attention that arrives when something registers. That's thinner, he said. Here, she said. And here. The wind hits these angles hardest. You compensate before the storm, not after. He nodded. He kept his hand on the wall. She began to explain. Not just the measurements and the intervals which she would give him too, but the principle underneath them, the thing that cattle had shown her on that August afternoon in 1880, the thing she had been living inside for 8 years without ever having fully articulated it to another person. A circle does not stop the wind, she said. It changes the wind's shape. The wind arrives expecting to hit a flat surface and finds a curve instead, and it has to go around, and in the going around it loses its force, and inside the circle there is a place that the wind does not fully reach. She pressed her palm against the wall one more time. You are not fighting the wind. You are refusing to give it what it needs to beat you. You are giving it a shape it cannot use against you. Eric was quiet for a moment. He looked at the wall and then at the prairie beyond it. The open expanse of Dakota territory that extended in all four directions without break flat and enormous and indifferent. Is that why we're still here, he said. That is part of why, she said. The other part is that we had no choice but to find another way. She began the morning's work assessing the wall section by section, the way she had assessed it every spring for 8 years. And Eric walked beside her and watched everything she did. And she explained what she was looking for and how she read what she found and what the readings meant for the repairs she would make. She taught him the way her mother had taught her, by doing it together, by letting the knowledge move through shared work into the hands that would carry it forward. The spring sun was warm on the weathered hay. The circle of compressed prairie grass stood in the March morning, looking exactly like what it was, something built from what was available by a person who had run out of other options, something that had outlasted the certainty of every person who had said it would fail, something that had no name and needed none. Inside the circle, the ground was already thawing faster than the prairie beyond the wall. By April, the soil would be ready to work. By May, the planting. By August, the cutting of fresh hay for the wall's annual renewal, the bales selected and stacked while the summer lasted, the preparation made. Before the need arrived, the work done in the season, when it could be done, so that the season, when it could not be done, would find everything ready. This was the rhythm Britta Sundvall had built her life around on the Dakota prairie. Not the drama of survival, which was real, but which was only the test, not the thing itself. The thing itself was the daily work, the annual renewal, the knowledge passed through hands that passed it to other hands. The circle rebuilt each autumn so that it could stand each winter. The principle that deflected what could not be stopped, applied again and again, until it was no longer remarkable, until it was simply what was done. She had $3, and she had watched cattle, and she had built a wall that saved her grandchildren's lives and then taught everyone who asked how to build one of their own. No one had called it the Sundvall method. She had never asked them to. The knowledge was worth more without her name on it, available to anyone, without the price of acknowledgement spreading through the county and beyond it, in the way that all genuinely useful knowledge spread unowned and unenclosed, moving from hands to hands until it belonged to the prairie itself. Britta pressed her palm flat against the hay wall in the March morning. It was solid. It was dense. 8 winters had worked it, and it had held. She began the repairs that would prepare it for the 9th.